welcome to another RPG book club. Today we're looking at Dreadnaught, Return of the Black Maw by Alex Beazle and Nicholas Ross. I've looked at this briefly before, but not really any more than briefly. Just noted that some of the formatting choices aren't really to my taste. But I also have looked, these are links. They do appear to work and go to the right place, which is actually relatively rare, I've found. And there is a ebook version of this as well as a PDF. The ebook version seems a bit, just better. It loads a bit faster, at least on this computer. It looks a little more pleasant when it's sort of bookish, but it's harder to zoom in on, and zooming in is something I need to do if I want anyone to actually read the text for these. But it's been a long time since I've done a project with enough pages to actually require a table of contents, but I do like to look at sort of whether the table of contents seem like they would be well organized from the beginning. The Dread and the Dread die, so I'm assuming some sort of central mechanic in the rolling resolution associated with it. Playing the game, just, how the game plays, generally how you go about playing the game probably makes sense to have it pretty early on. Preparing the players, that's something that might only be relevant to the GM, so it's a little surprising to see it this early, but that's not necessarily an issue or something I disagree with, just slightly abnormal perhaps. Yeah, normally you would have character creation before anything relevant to the GM specifically. That's a convention of how these books usually go, but it's not necessarily a convention I think is better, so we'll have to see whether it works for this game the way it is now. Now, surviving the Dreadmaker, more GM specific stuff. Yeah, so all of this seems to make sense generally, assuming that this is this is an example adventure, which is at the end, which makes the most sense in how it's typically done. But anyway, getting into the actual game. Yeah, since there's, roughly 88 pages of this, and I definitely want to get through a decent chunk, I'm probably not going to be reading out much aloud. The godly relics of grief-sick angels. That's certainly a lot more specific than Gold or Glory. I may as well read at least the intro concept. Dreadnaught is a narrative role-playing game about heroes surviving in a grim, drowned world known as the Weirdos. A little hard to read and say, but not terrible. Players take on the roles of grizzled heroes searching for gold, glory, or the godly relics of grief-sick angels. One player is the Dreadmaker, the DM. It's always nice when they make sure the acronym goes to DM or GM, even though it's not necessarily Dungeon or Game Master. The DM referees the game and helps players drive their story forward by increasing the dread. I wonder if will sort of be like a clock. You might not have encountered it before because not that many RPGs have them, but a lot of RPGs have some sort of clock feature where it's basically just a set of stages that things happen or advance in, and specific conditions for that advancing. It's a little hard to explain without, a specific example, but perhaps this will be one. It already looks like it's how far things advance is by dice roll, which I haven't seen that often in clocks, so it might not bear that much of a similarity. Dread is the game's core mechanic. It determines how terrorized the heroes are and how difficult it is for them to act and survive. What the players do and encounter during the game can raise or lower the dread. Each player tracks their dread by adding or removing ticks from the tracker. As the dread increases, their dread die grows. So I'm not sure if that means the amount the ticks increase by grow or the consequences of those ticks do, or both. But here's a good place to start talking about some of the way things are laid out. Like, it's very sort of chaotic looking, which fits, but, potentially fits the theme, but I don't necessarily love, especially when things bleed across pages and when it's specifically just sort of a black highlighting effect. Like, I guess now that I zoom in on this, it's actually sort of more organic than I had thought it would be, but from a distance, it basically just looks like there's a black highlighter that's going over a ton of stuff, so that doesn't really make it feel, chaotic or insane or anything other than just highlighted in black randomly, which to me is not necessarily pleasant or indicative of a wider theme, just glancing at it. And then occasionally the color choices make things actually hard to read. Like, it's not as much here, but you've got some white on white, you've got some, basically just the white on white makes things more difficult. And for a lot of people, I'm sure, like, I'm doing okay now, but this could get a little difficult, especially if you're not zooming in. And that said, there is a plain text version, so that should help. Okay. So moves, which implies some sort of powered by the apocalypse inspiration, and they roll 2d8 when they make a move with the dread die and compare the results, but it doesn't really say, what you're comparing them to. They roll 2d8 with the dread die and compare the results. So are they rolling 2d8 and also rolling the dread die, or is the DM the one rolling the dread die? But anyway, you compare the 2d8 to the dread die. That's what seems to be the case. Okay, a strong hit if they're both bigger than dread. Weak hit if only one is higher. A miss if neither is higher. Okay. So I don't like the way this is sort of written, because it's talking about things before they're introduced, We haven't really been over how the dread die increases per se, and it's already talking about capping it. And how it's standard to have it capped at a d8 for multiple sessions, which is a little, for stories with multiple sessions, which is a little confusing to me, because you'd think the longer things are going to go on, the higher the cap is going to be. And it's kind of like, it's saying increasing the cap makes things inherently deadlier, but that kind of implies that the rate is going to increase a lot. It's just a lot of stuff I can't really understand at this point without wider context. Especially this, because it's saying you can choose to share dread, but everything up to this point would have, made me assume that that is the... What do you call it? That's the defaults, rather than an option. Yeah, because it's like the dread, it's not individual dreads, plural. Okay, each player tracks their dread. So if I had actually been reading carefully, I would have known that it can be individual players. Yep. But you can, You can do it communally, and that makes things increase faster, I'm assuming, because anytime it would, go to a single player, it instead goes to the communal thing with no adjustment, which is sort of good to know. It's definitely a bold choice to not alter the rules to lessen that a bit if you're doing things not individually. But yeah, it's not as bad as I thought now that I noticed that it is talking about it being individually before it says that you can do it communally instead. For some reason, in my initial read through of this, I didn't really pick out the each player thing and got the impression that it was always communal. I haven't remarked on the art before. It's good. Not much else to say about that. So far, anyway. Okay, unimaginable dread. When the dread is full, the heroes begin to lose their grip on reality and must roll 2d8 to face the unimaginable dread. So I'm still not clear on whether we've actually established how dread is increased in the first place, per se. Alright, yeah, double checking this page again. It really doesn't say much about how, why, or by how much dread might increase. And it also doesn't really say what the consequences of dread are generally. Like from this, I can assume that, the higher dread gets, the higher a character's dread gets, the, lower their chance of success. But it doesn't really say that. It just says strong hit, weak hit, miss, and I have to guess at what those really mean. And while still being unsure of, everything about increasing and decreasing and what dread actually means, even in the context of success and failure, we're already going to what happens when dread is full, which I definitely think is, way too soon to be going over this. And when the dread is full, lose the grip on reality, 2d8 face unimaginable dread. Okay, and this I'm guessing is the results of the 2d8 rule. Okay. The hero becomes a husk controlled by the DM. That doesn't really explain a lot. Maybe if I knew what the word husk meant in the context of this game, I'd know more. But at this point, it's kind of just like confusing in terms of why that would make the game better, because, it gets rid of a player's control of a character, but it doesn't really outline that it would do so in a way that would lead to the death of that character quickly, which would mean a player would lose agency for a long time, or that, maybe a player would create a new character while the husk is controlled by the DM. It's just, for something this, dramatic, I think you really need more of a descriptor than that. Even, if you want to leave things up to the discretion of the table for something like taking away a player's character for an indefinite period of time, there definitely needs to be more detail. But, maybe if I knew what a husk was, unless that's not just the general case of the word, if husk is something very specific to the setting, then maybe that would explain things, but I don't know. Okay, until the dread falls, moves you make besides steal yourself add +1 dread. Now that's confusing, because when dread is full, this is what happens, potentially. So if dread is full, why does adding dread matter? And, if that continues even after dread has decreased a bit, I can see that, still mattering. but the term dread falls, once again, without knowing what that means in the context of the game, it just sounds like that until you have less than full dread, you always add dread for whatever you do, but your dread is already full, so it's unclear why that would matter. Like, I think dreadfall is supposed to be a specific thing that doesn't necessarily just happen as soon as your dread decreases, but, without that concept being introduced, this just seems very confusing. Okay, catatonic for 1d4 hours and returns with phasm sickness. I would have expected a lot of these for unimaginable dread to be, I don't know, more dramatic consequences. Like, that in theory could be very dramatic. It's very dramatic for the player, but in terms of the actual game, I don't know that it changes much for the character necessarily. Okay, and like, there's a solid chance that nothing happens as well. Well, not really a solid chance, but like is that technically a 1 in 8, I think? Okay, I mean, not really technically. Math gets kind of complicated when you're using multiple dice, but basically, it's not an incredibly slim chance that just nothing happens during unimaginable dread, which seems a little odd. Okay, was the term making dread used before? Okay. Making dread is here. And then we see making dread again. What does this making dread header mean? Is it just sort of like a side for the person reading the book? Or is it a reference to a specific mechanic or something? Dreadful abilities are how characters level in Dreadnaught. Alright, so yeah, dreadful abilities are how heroes level in Dreadnaught. Yeah, and they can be interpreted a lot of ways, but they have the same mechanical benefits regardless of how they're interpreted, presumably. Okay, and you can, if there's any overlap, you can change things around a bit, which is nice. And that note is relevant here because fathom sickness is one of the things that gets you dreadful abilities. Okay, D8 to see what symptoms afflicts them. In order to use a dreadful ability, you have to add 1 dread, so that's one of the ways dread increases, which is interesting. I've always found a resource management system that involve adding an amount to some kind of value that represents a threat to be a bit more interesting than a traditional system where you just have to spend a certain amount of resource to do a thing. Okay. So that really doesn't, say what that actually does mechanically. And for something like seeing the future, that is really rough. I mean, I guess as a DM, I'd maybe just give them advantage on checks and stuff, but that's really hard to interpret how exactly you're supposed to do that in an RPG. I don't know what the word polyphonic means. But there's another thing where it's like, how do you actually do that? Does the player just make up things that, the dead are supposed to be saying, which, would be effectively useless unless they're altering the world by saying those things? Or does the DM do it, and then does the DM do it at the player's request or just randomly? There's a lot of stuff here that really doesn't offer you, it's very vague mechanically and hard to figure out how you would implement it in an RPG specifically. These are also both, so far, informational abilities, effectively. So if there's not details to them, you could say they more or less come to the same thing. You just get some information that, might be valuable to you. Okay. Once again, really no description of what that does or why you would want to do that. Like, I'm sure it can work in his attack, but is it functionally better than a normal attack? Like, I don't think most people want to have blood extracted into them, or is it just sort of pooling on the ground rather than going into the person extracting it? Okay, Ancient Secrets. So again, another informational thing. This one, at least, I can see how it would specifically be different, because it has to be stuff from the past, not necessarily stuff that relates to the present situation, but still another informational thing. Okay, you can meld into a shadow, but do not linger there. Again, not a lot of description, but this one, at least, I think is far easier to interpret. A person can go into a shadow, and thereby probably can't be spotted or harmed, but you have to make up some consequence for, being there too long if that happens. Like this one, it is not, specific at all, but it's very easy to interpret versus something like, the dead speak through you. When, if this was just like a story you're writing, that could potentially be easy, but in something like an RPG, where players and DMs have to have different roles and different amounts of knowledge and stuff like that, this is very confusing. This is not very practical. This I personally prefer more detailed rules with more specific mechanical elements, but this is actually useful and decently easy to interpret despite being vague, so if you're going for vagueness, it should be more with things like this. Okay, your cadaverous eyes can freeze the blood. So I don't know if that's literal or supposed to inspire fear, and like when something completely changes the context of the ability depending on how it's interpreted, I should know which of those that's supposed to be. Okay, again, extremely vague. Maybe the vaguest one here. It definitely sounds cool, but I really don't think... It's hard to explain why. Like, there are a lot of things you can get by with in RPGs that are just okay sounding cool, but for stuff like this, it's not really that way, because it relies on both the DM and the player to agree what this means for this to actually work. Like, just for exciting the imagination and stuff, this is fun. Or creating a story yourself, but for trying to work together to make something happen, this is just kind of not helpful. Okay, no longer fear death, you are dead already. And I don't know if that's metaphorical or literal. So far I'm really not liking the dreadful abilities. Like, I think they're written in a way that sounds cool, but they would be very hard to use in the context of an RPG, I think. Like, this is the only one I think is solid and actionable. Okay, playing the game. Let me go back a bit, just one thing. And so this is a 7/14 out of So many possible values. Ah. Yeah, and also, since all of these things are, things you activate at will, except maybe that, since they're all activated at will, it's kind of hard to say how there is any real downside from Fathom Sickness. Like, you could say that the catatonic thing is a downside, but it's not saying that Fathom Sickness causes that, because you return with Fathom Sickness after it occurs, so there's no real downside for something that's called a sickness, it appears. And, it's definitely going to be interesting to see what other contexts people can get dreadful abilities in, what other dreadful abilities there are, assuming there are other ones, what separates Fathom Sickness from all of that when it's just something that grants you dreadful abilities and has no other effect. Okay. Creating the heroes. No, we're not starting there. Playing the game. Prepare the players. Gather game materials. Set expectations. Define themes, goals, and rules. I like that we have this little layout of all the things this chapter is going to teach you and how to navigate it and stuff, potentially. Yeah. Stuff like this is something rulebooks sometimes miss, where they just focus far too much on the mechanics of character creation and don't really tell the reader to actually make a character, so it's nice to see that this probably won't fall into that trap, at least. Inflicting harms. Build your story. Okay. Preparing the players. The stacks, character sheets, pencils, dice. Okay, cool. It's very cool that this has gone over, sort of like a session 0 style element. Okay, and these things are explained. Okay, here's surviving in a dreadful world. A lot of crazy people, cosmic horrors, there's a sea. Now this is a little confusing. Like, I get the sentiment, because terrorize is not the same as terrify. In other words, bad things are supposed to happen to the players. Sorry, to the characters, but not really the players. The players should be enjoying all of it. That said, because, terrorize is so similar to terrify, despite them being similar words, it does make it kind of sound like the players are not supposed to be afraid during the experience at all, which seems a bit odd for a horror-style game. Yeah, okay, that's good. To tell a horror story together that's compelling and surprising. Players are encouraged to ask the DM questions and make decisions that drive the story forward. Yeah, heroes might die, but there are some effects from that. Learning the game. Okay, it's a narrative RPG. Okay. It might be a little late to establish that. Let me go back a bit. No, in the beginning we go for narrative. I wasn't really paying attention to that at the time, I guess. Like, that doesn't, for me, really change how these abilities are. I understand a bit more why they're so vague now, but unless I'm vastly misinterpreting the way storytelling works for this game, I'd still say these are not phrased in helpful ways. Like, my opinion on the abilities hasn't changed at all so far, but I get a bit why they are written like that. Okay, no stats, attributes, or modifiers. Okay, you pick a move to see if they make that move. To see if they make that move is a little confusing. I'll have to see what they mean by that later, because that kind of makes it seem like just to see if they do the thing you want them to do. But maybe it means succeed at doing that move. It's, the phrasing's a little odd there. Okay, 2d8 and the dread die. Both dice higher. Okay, what rule means? Yeah, so failure, and what that does is context sensitive. Yeah, I shouldn't be trying to talk and read at the same time. Roll high, think ahead, and work together to survive. Like, this seems a little less narrative focused, per se. That makes it seem like there's a definitive goal that people are sort of strategizing to achieve, which is often not as much the case in narrative games. Okay, creating survivors. Possessed fanatics, avaricious pirate kings, desperate survivors, heroes are scarce, none without sin and regret. Imagine who they are first. Which is a little interesting, because usually you're gonna want something to go off of before you start that. Okay, how is surviving the real roads warp them? What makes them heroic despite this? What do they dread most? What code do they keep? Party to factions? What times do I have? So a lot of questions, but not really saying how those questions are answered during the process of character creation. And so now we have a table that I definitely don't understand right now. Prefix, suffix. I guess that's name. And are you, like, re-rolling, like, do you roll the d20 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times to come up with all this? I guess. Okay. So would something be like Barthy, who is a hardy pugilist that dreads storms and has a code of burning warlocks. A little bit of a hodgepodge there. It's also, sort of confusing how imagining who a character is first and then having a table that involves randomization is going to come together, but let's see. Okay, joining a faction. When did we get to joining a faction? I still don't really know if this is an abridged rule set or not. Let me see. No, that's what I was doing. Okay, create the heroes. Generate name and detail, and then faction. Joining a faction. There appears to be more information on factions than anything involving the character. Okay, now we're on to character stuff. Let's see. So these are probably the equivalent of classes. Yeah, so you look at class, quote-unquote, last. Yeah, it says they don't have stats, attribute, or modifiers, but not they don't have a class equivalent. But to sort of explain how odd this is to me, the way character creation is set up. First, in theory, I don't know anything specific about the setting or anything like that, but right off the bat, I imagine how they are. I imagine how surviving in this setting I don't know a ton about has affected them, what makes them heroic, and the sort of things they dread most, what code do they keep, are they party to a faction? I imagine all of that sort of off of nothing. Then we have a randomized table with no real explanation to it. I'm going to assume that this is an alternate method if you do not want to actually imagine things yourself, or just something to serve as inspiration from imagining. So say I wanted to create a character named George or something, may as well go with something similar, and I was trying to think of what traits he would have. Like, there's nothing really on this table that correlates to how surviving in the weird woods had warped them, at least in the beginning. I guess the code is supposed to be heroism, but it's sort of separated. You have code there and what makes them heroic here. Basically, just, I don't feel like this table correlates very well to what is being suggested here. And the table isn't really explained. But without the table, I don't really have a lot to go off of to interpret this. And then after I've already done that, we move on to, things that is more like setting information all the way down to archetypes. Okay. So, I'm supposed to imagine what my character is like entirely and how they interact with the setting and stuff before I even think about what kind of abilities they have, but that you would think would have to do a lot with their character. Like, it's hard to think how someone would have come onto this path without having, without imagining that affecting their life in some way. So it's weird that this is picked last, is what I'm saying. Anyway, moving on to actually looking at some of this stuff instead of just explaining how the order's a bit odd. Yeah, okay, so now you're explicitly randomizing your backstory, even though you were supposed to have already imagined a lot of this stuff. I just don't think the character creation process makes sense pretty much at all here. Okay, here, then roll a d6 to what past deeds led them to join it. On a 5 to 6, the faction becomes their enemy, and they are bound to no faction at all. That's an interesting way to do things. So I'm not sure how the Dreadmaker would use these details to... Okay, I see what they're saying. Basically just use the character's backstory to plan around the campaign, but the character's backstory is partially determined by these roles. Okay, the Inquisition. I think you would definitely start out with rolling faction before you dealt with any other aspect of character creation. Is probably the right way to do things if you intend it to, explain stuff about the setting and determine partially a character's backstory. Okay. So this is kind of feeling a little word salady to me. Up to this point, that's all fine. Yeah, that's also fine. They hunt relics and sinners and get them. And then here we have the relics they archive, the sinners they consecrate into soulless vessels possessed by the mad Eidolons, or however you pronounce that one. They adore and dread. That really doesn't mean anything to me at this point. And the rest of this, kind of seems like, what you would expect from incinerators. Except maybe coming from the scorched hells in the vast, which is another thing I don't really have any context for. Okay. You've sailed to forbidden shores, and the Inquisition would have those maps in your mind. I think they mean would have in this context, as in would like to obtain, but that sort of explains why the Inquisition wants you, not really why you ended up joining them. I guess since it says the Inquisition found you, they sort of just impress you into the ranks. Oppress you, I don't know what the phrase is there quite. Okay, this has a bit more of a motive for why you would want to join them. Okay, this is, interesting backstory, but again, it's not really the motivator in and of itself for you to have joined the Inquisition. Though I suppose devotee is itself supposed to be the explanation. You're just, a zealot, and this is all some of the stuff you did in that zealotry, not the actual reason, which is that. Right. So he bled his kingdom dry to buy godhood. Did he actually obtain it, or did he merely attempt to obtain it? Okay. Interesting sort of through line here. We've got the heretic king having a crown and the thief having stolen a crown. Okay. I don't know what's meridional. Meridional, I suppose, like meridians. Don't quite know what that means, but you got a boat. Okay. It would definitely help to have certain terms like Fathom Keeper defined from the beginning. And it is kind of inconsistent because, because, the deep things are defined, but the Fathom Keeper, which comes up more, is not. Like, I know this is definitely a shared setting with other things, so there's some assumption that you have certain amounts of knowledge coming into it, but even still, some of the more important terms I would like to have had defined at this point. Right? Interesting. So you probably don't have a face if you're part of this faction. Or, the skin that was on your face. I'd say all of the faction information has been enjoyable so far. Then we get on to archetype/class thing. Okay, that's nice. You know, at the beginning of the game, it might not be that valuable, but basically, you're always good at doing this one thing because the failure die is inherently lower. And I'm guessing that this is not a dread ability that you have to increase dread to use, but who knows? Okay. Alright. Weapons. Hold the marrow. Yeah, this formatting is not helpful right now. So this, I think, belongs to the same thing this does, but, you know, it's right to left for some reason. And this goes together, I think. Okay, hold the marrow. When you warp bones into bladed weapons. Yeah, the phrasing of PBTA has always confused me a little, but I think that's standard. The when, instead of say you can or something. Making kill moves, you inflict 2 harm. Right, so you're basically guaranteed to damage when you attack, as long as you're using warped bones. Are you supposed to be warping your bones, or one that you've sort of just found lying around? And this is not clear whether it's harm to yourself from warping your bones, or just the enemy strikes back. And it's not just, you know, when you warp bones into bladed weapons, it's when you warp bones into bladed weapons and attack, basically. Okay, dead returns to life injured, and you suffer 2 harm. It's interesting that there's more of a cost the more successful you are. And suffer 1 harm, they come back as a husk, 1 harm, and add 1 dread, nothing happens. And you specifically are giving one of your life, or part of your life. See with Devil's Sight. Okay, you peer into their mind and twist their thoughts. It's sort of odd that it's called Devil's Sight for that, but who knows? Okay, strong hit. Earn a gain for your next sway move. No idea what that means. Okay, strong hit, but you get dread. The mind is shut to your eye. Add 1 dread. So nothing happens and you add dread. Now, again, I don't know if any of these abilities are supposed to be dread abilities that add dread inherently or not. Yeah, for the rest of these, I'm probably mostly going to skim. And this one is having some sort of overlap with the flesh warping thing already. Okay, so I guess that fails there. Yeah, like, usually their mind is shut to your eye, they're gone. Both of these failure conditions imply that it doesn't work. The ritual is dreadful doesn't really imply that it fails inherently, but because it doesn't say same as something else, I guess it fails. It's not really clear on that one. Because it doesn't really say anything that implies failure, just that, it's dreadful. To ward your soul with a soul kith. Is that summon the deep? Is this all summon the deep? I guess. Okay. Honestly, you kind of want a weak hit on this. Because reducing Dread by a d4 and getting a random boon does sound very, very good. Yeah, like this, the Soulkith rejects you. That definitely implies overall failure, so that's fine. Inflicts 1 harm, suffers 2 harm. So you're summoning this. Yeah, I don't know what inflicts 1 harm, suffers 2 harm means. Like, are you suffering harm? Are you inflicting harm on someone? Is the albatross inflicting and suffering harm? I still don't know what a gain is. Yeah, and I don't really know what these mean. You get gains, and these creatures also have some qualities, it looks like. Okay. Right. These seem to have very different effects, depending on what kind of hit it is. Okay, I missed this. Alright. So that seems consistent as well. Each class may grant a certain minimum chance at success at certain basic things. Now this one is different. And I had to stop for a while and I skipped ahead because I thought, I wasn't really getting a good picture of what the system actually was from looking at these aspects of it. So moving on past this as well. Like, this is all stuff I want to look back on later, but I'm not focusing on it for now. I've actually found, from looking at the game overall, that it seems like it's trying to be something of a cross between a PBTA game and an OSR game, which is a fairly odd combination. I'll be able to explain a bit more of that later. Alright, so looking at this, we have, sort of general goals for the DM. And that's all, fairly good and everything. And then we have sort of like a, it's described as one to make moves and stuff, but I would say it's more of a roadmap for how to DM the game. Like, when the dread die grows, you produce a horror. When players ask what happens next, you throw a hazard at them, which does sound sort of, what do you call it? Hostile, but when they go to a new location, throw in a new character. When a hero becomes injured, potentially kill a character. When a hero dies, do these things. Just generally harm them. But, it's sort of just anytime something happens, you sort of respond with a move and not something pre-prepared. Like you throw, pre-prepared by the resource manual, but not by you yourself. Like, you throw a monster at them, you throw a hazard at them, you make a character, not necessarily, like, a character that you know. Like, it's not a specific named NPC most of the time. It looks like you just sort of make a character for them to interact with. It's all kind of, every time the players do something, just throw a semi-randomized point of interest at them, and then when they overcome or get through that, move on to the next thing. That's sort of one of the ways it's less like a really narrative-focused game and more like OSR. It's almost like the whole world is a dungeon, and each new room, there's either an NPC, a hazard, or a monster, and then they sort of just do that, move on, and go on to the next room where it repeats. It's not really narrative-based in that sense, it seems. But anyway, we'll move on to the Doom Die, which is another system. I'm going to have to go back and look at sort of the different sets of systems that have been introduced in a minute, but the Doom dice are binary d6s. I don't know why they're d6s specifically, because, up to this point it's been, well, I'd say it's been d8s, but you need different dice constantly for the dread die, so I guess it may as well be d6s. But, basically it's a coin flip. One represents 1, 0, one represents 0, and the higher it is, the more dangerous the result is. Every 15 minutes, there's another Doom die. Once you get 4 of them, which is an hour, you roll for a result. So it's kind of like a... it's not clear whether that's supposed to be 15 minutes in or out of game, really, though. But, every set period of time, this is another sort of mechanism where every set period of time a randomized result happens, and that seems to be the name thing that presents hazards or dangers and moves the, or not really moves the plot forward, but gives players something to do, is sort of just another random interval of stuff happening. They can find a useful item and lower the dread if you somehow manage to get 0 on all 4 dies, which I guess is only a, let's see. Yeah, now that would be a pretty low chance if I'm right. Then, things get worse. And dread is added. Yeah, hazard is encountered and dread is added. A horror appears and dread is added. Yeah, something really bad happens, or 1d4 dread is added. And then you reset the Doom dice. And also the weather changes. But I was going to say, oh yeah, and if a move wastes time, you add another Doom die, even though that's only 15 minutes for one player. That's sort of, not entirely accurate to what would be happening in game potentially, but ensuring that, one person does something for 15 minutes, even if they don't want to, and then tracking what everyone else does for that span of time gets complicated. So just adding extra time on the artificial time measuring thing rather than forcing the narrative to actually comply with that probably makes more sense overall. Okay. And then, yeah, and if they're asking, this part kind of confused me. If the players ask a yes or no question, again, this is a lot of stuff about random generation of things, which is a bit odder to me in a narrative-based game, but basically, you can let fate decide whether the answer to something players are unsure about is yes or no using dice. And then if it's not, oh, no, this is something different. This is kind of confusing. Okay, now I think I get it. Okay. Because it's not 2d6, it's a d6 and the dread die. And then you get 2d6. And it's more likely to be yes or no based on you dropping one of them if, you want to mess with the odds a little. The higher the dread die is, the more likely things are going to be no. And I guess that assumes that answer to the question being no is bad, but that's kind of, that really depends on the question. Anyway, if there's uncertainty and it's not just a yes or no answer, you have this sort of helpful randomization thing to see what happens next or what players encounter next, but it's all locations, which I feel like is not very helpful. Like, it's just, what does the next place they're going to run into look like, really? And that doesn't do anything. Like, it's a lot more focus on the aesthetic than anything with more meaning or substance, and I think that's honestly consistent with a lot of the storytelling in this. It's really focused on sort of the style of things and not, what actually happens, what the meat of them is, or why they matter. There we go, and now the hazards. So this is another random thing that can sort of show up along with monsters. You gotta find light before darkness drives you mad, get to high ground before rising current drown you, extinguish a fire, broken ground, yeah. So these are all, I think, interesting and fair, to have. The issue is there is not anything in this rulebook which really indicates what might be a barrier to any of this. Like, if you just have a torch, you just light it and that's over. Getting to high ground, assuming there is high ground somewhere, you just walk to it and you're fine, right? This one presents an obvious problem that you would have to use actual moves and make decisions to do. But stuff like this, it's not clear what challenges would ever really come with interacting in your environment in this system, so to speak. Maybe I'll be able to explain that better later. Okay, that one, again, I guess you could figure out what to do for that, but the DM would just have to figure out what kind of check they want players to make to not get lost, really. When in doubt, just add 1 dread. Alright. Okay, and now we get to the horrors. So, what I wanted to look over was really look at all the basic sort of mechanics of this game. So we're gonna ignore this for now. That, like, just taking this, 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 this all communicates that, stuff sort of just happens. And the players, interact with it in sort of non-specific ways without any sort of pre-planning or narrative focus or story, so to speak. Like, that's all about stuff sort of just happening. This is kind of also about that, but there's a more specific mechanic with it. It's like every hour, one of these things triggers, basically. Every hour, one of those things potentially triggers, and dread potentially increases. So there are events every time you get to a new location, basically, or something changes, there's an event. Every hour, there's potentially an event. And the hour events, at least, probably increase dread, whereas these might. Okay, and then going all the way back, we can get to what increasing dread's about. So basically, every time dread increases, the main factor in which is the events that occur, but mainly the sort of hour-based clock that triggers, dread increases, and then the result of that dread is that players succeed less effectively. So events randomly are triggering constantly, and specifically at every hour, definitely. And as this continues, things get harder and harder to succeed at. However, that's sort of it for dread, mostly. Things just get harder to succeed at. It's not really a sanity effect. There's a horror element missing if, this is supposed to be horror-based. Yes, there are dangerous things happening. Yes, the longer things last, the harder things get. But that's sort of it. Like, the danger and time factor themselves are supposed to be the things that are scary, rather than actually trying to create an atmosphere of horror other than sort of the visuals of locations. To put it another way, when you've got something like Call of Cthulhu, you've got like a sanity meter. Well, not really a meter, but a sanity. And, that has an effect on your character, on their personality, on how they might hallucinate. Even when sanity isn't necessarily involved, there's like supernatural stuff going on. There's effects, there's dreams, because it's not just like the way the game is formatted. Even when you get into the provided sample campaign, it's all very much randomization and enemy based. There is not here that narratively really fuels horror other than the fact that danger exists, which is an issue. Like, once you get into another thing that dread does is stuff happens when you fill it up all the way. But I've already went over earlier how some of these things aren't really great. They're pretty vague. Like this, now that I've looked at terrors, I can say the Husk is a specific enemy. So that is, one of the player characters gets taken over and becomes an enemy. There's a relatively small list, for dread effects, given that dread is something so central to the system. There's like 4 results, and then for one of those options, there's more sub-results, but that's mainly gaining an ability. It's not really clear how these abilities are supposed to represent leveling. Like, the other stuff, I think, is maybe a little too focused on combat and sort of hazards for something that is supposed to be a narrative system and doesn't really communicate horror in a way, I think. But this stuff is kind of actively underdeveloped because, we've got the dreadful abilities, which is another way of increasing dread, but they're very vague, and nothing else in the system mechanically is nearly this vague. Like, the class abilities are actually pretty specific compared to these. And then there's no really explanation of what Fathom Sickness is or whether it's supposed to be key anywhere else. And then like this one just doesn't really seem to work because I have not seen Dreadfall as a specific mechanic, which to me indicates basically that, like I said earlier, once you get this, dread keeps going up until you find a way to decrease it, but you only get it when dread is at max, so that seems, irrelevant because you're adding something to a maxed out meter that stops getting added to as soon as it decreases at all. So this one just doesn't really make sense. Like I said, it's not clear how dreadful abilities matter, whether class abilities are dreadful abilities, what these are supposed to do specifically. Like, these mechanics seem vastly less developed than the other mechanics, and they seem to be more the things that would actually relate to stuff focused on your character or stuff focused on horror, instead of just things that are bad because they are dangerous. Let me rebook. Yeah, when dread is full, not when it gets to the highest die possible. Like, dread is in theory the game's core mechanic, and yeah, it applies to rolls, but basically, when you get down to it, dread is just, when it is higher, the dice that makes things hard is higher. So the central mechanic is just things get harder over time, and that's sort of simplistic. Sure, there are different effects for failures, which makes the overall effect of dread more complicated, but essentially, dread is not very dreadful, and it does kind of seem like ultimately the random events triggering every hour and just enemies showing up and hazards just sort of happening is really going to be more important and more obviously present than the dread slowly increasing over time. So it does feel a little unfocused compared to the other stuff. I don't know how that happened. And it is odd in such a sort of game that describes itself as so narrative focused to have not a lot of stuff relating to narrative. When it tells you how to run the game, it sort of just tells you that stuff happens and here are some enemies or hazards you can throw at players, and that's about the extent of it. It doesn't tell you to write a story, it doesn't tell you to have named NPCs, nothing like that. And it doesn't really tell you how to build dread or horror. I don't mean dread as in the mechanic, but dread as in the thing. Or have mechanics that I feel like really add to a horror-based game. Like, to an extent, things getting harder over time, does matter, sure. But that's about it, and it doesn't really seem like dread directly actually increases based on things players encounter most of the time. A lot of the time, it's just the result of a failure state instead of being representative of players seeing something really horrifying, it seems like. Like this and just failing rolls seems to be mainly the thing that increases dread. And so it's sort of just like no matter what, it just slowly goes up over time without really being representative of horror, so to speak. But to talk a little bit more about how, things feel somewhat mostly random or dungeony rather than narrative-y. Yeah, I'll also look at I didn't really look at the plot for this, so I'll look at that too. Not the plot so much, but the theming, I guess, for this, because there's not really a plot to it. Okay, a high tower. 3 days ago, they sent out Gareth? Who's Gareth? To scavenge supplies. They gave him up for dead until he returned this morning, covered in oil, crazed and blathering about a demon ship in the market, the Black Maw. So it's not even clear how, it opens with everyone in a high tower, but why are they in a high tower? Okay, there's a wreck that has damned the city somehow and is talking to him. The supplies are gone. What supplies? The supplies in the tower or somewhere else. No one is coming. The heroes must find a way to survive somehow. This all feels very vague. Yeah, and there are two options for success. You either find a ship and escape the city. Now, this cursive is, well, it's not even cursive, but this text is not easy to read. Or you can try to destroy the Black Maw. Yeah, the city is ruined by the Black Maw, I guess, but they were all already... No, because the city's flooded, so that might be why they're in the tower. And it's not clear if the Black Maw caused the flood or if it just sort of came later. Reverse the ballast pump and destroy the ship's engine. Okay. And I caught some of this narrative stuff already, but not much of it. Alright, the rivals. Okay, there are a bunch of heroes fighting through the drowned city, apparently. Shen seeks the city's secrets. The Resemi practice false belief, worshipping the sea as if it were God. Okay, so the Inquisition is in the city looking for relics. Yeah, the Heretic King wants survivors to serve. These are all labeled as rival, but a lot of the player characters will actually belong to these factions, which isn't really addressed. Okay, just sort of looting. Okay, and the Trade League actually seems like they're kind of trying to restore order. That's kind of like if you had to pick a good guys out of this group, I guess you'd pick them. Okay, navigate through the city to find a ship or the Black Maw, making journey moves. Yeah, and so if the players succeed, they can go where they want. If they miss, they sort of just randomly end up somewhere, even if it's far away. Which, in a supernatural or horror campaign kind of works. Each location includes a description for the DM to share with the players and a list of horrors they might encounter. And they can interpret and address these details to move the story. So basically, you go to different places, but those places don't have anything in them except maybe enemies and what they look like. It's all very bare bones and empty. And I get that you're sort of supposed to, the DM can, in theory, fill these things with stuff for the players to do, but ultimately, when the goal is just to go from map space to map space, there's really no reason to fill these spaces unless to add obstacles, and there are already going to be an obstacle every hour. So it might be a little extreme every in-game hour, not necessarily out-of-game hour. Okay, yeah, and there are hazards also happening randomly, so if the DM added any obstacles, it would probably be too many at this point, and it's unclear what you would want to put in these spaces, really. Because it's not like you're trying to solve a mystery. Like, the one thing that's maybe relevant is where exactly the Black Maw is, and it doesn't really establish that the players aren't supposed to know that already. But, like, the one thing is clues to where the Black Maw is. But when that's just a ship that is somewhere, it's kind of hard to say why there would be, like, a large number of clues to that when one would suffice. It's not, like I said, it's not really a mystery, just something the players might not happen to know. Okay. And this is additional things other than events. And this doesn't seem that important, but you know, it might affect atmosphere a bit. Now, this is a very odd map because you've got like you've got like outlines on a map, but then it's covered by an image of the city. It's just very hard to understand what's being communicated there. Yeah, I don't really know why it would be a dead city just from the flood, and especially when, there are supposed to be survivors. So, dead city is maybe not the right term there. But, it gives you the probability of encountering these places, which is nice. And you can pick where to go that is nearby if you succeed on the rule, but it's not like it's kind of difficult to figure out just from this what is nearby. What is even the starting point? I guess maybe the observatory. And it doesn't say on this map where the maw is even. Okay, near the Driftglass rocket. So that's over there. So saying you start there, it would be, 1, 2, 3 successful moves to get there, assuming you knew where you were going. And if you kept failing and had to pick randomly, it would be about Yeah, okay, I think I calculated this before. I could be wrong, but I think it's about a 6 in 36 chance that you'll encounter it randomly, which means a 1 in 6 chance. Yeah, it should be about a 6 in 36 chance. So if you're randomizing it, there's a solid 1 in 6 chance that you'll get there. You could in theory get there faster through failing than succeeding. It's not even that unlikely. But of course, maybe you're not trying to get to the Black Maw. Maybe you're trying to find a seaworthy ship. Yeah, and so like you've got the description of the locations, horrors you might encounter, and that's it. And that's like all there is to the adventure is locations, monsters you might encounter in them, and a goal, which to me is not really conducive to, a narrative-based game. And like I mean the descriptions are all cool definitely, but that's sort of why I'm saying it feels like a PBTA and OSR mix. The PBTA, the mechanics are relatively spare and move based, and OSR, it's a lot of randomization, monsters, and effectively a dungeon crawl, even if it's technically a city. And that's not like, I don't think that's necessarily inherently at odds, but it does seem like it's specifically trying to be a PBTA narrative system, and I'm not really seeing a lot of the narrative aspects. Like, there's a lot of stuff open to interpretation, but that's not inherently narrative. That's just, leaving out details in a sense. It can be conducive to narrative, but only if, it builds to something. Okay, a submersible possessed by the deep things. It's living. When they find it, they get 1d4 dread. And they can use torpedoes in the armaments to destroy it, or they can devise their own methods to destroy the wreck as well. So, in other places it's stated they do need to get to the engine room to destroy it. So I don't know if that meshes with this or not. And then the armament room might be helpful for that, but they also have to do something to the ballast tanks according to way back here. Yeah, like reverse the ballast pumps. I don't know enough about anything to know why that is, something that's there and it's not explained. And it's sort of just left out when other times the goals are stated. So I don't know if that's really supposed to be something you're doing or not. Again, some definitely cool descriptions, but mostly just of substance. There is a list of enemies you might encounter. Okay, and then this, I don't think this applies to the module sort of thing. I think this is, just setting stuff, but I really can't be sure. Maybe this is supposed to be the stuff you have to do if you escape. And then the horrors. Like, this is a very important NPC in theory. But while, their health, I found out what suffers and inflicts means. This is the damage they do, this is how much damage they can take. Other than her damage and health being set, her abilities are very vague, which is kind of strange if you're going to, really specify the damage and health. Like, that's more important than what the character can actually do. So it's hard to tell, how this is whether this would be balanced or anything, because I don't really know what her abilities are, but then a lot of it will just be the fact that she's got a lot of crew with her. Yeah, so from there on in, it's a lot of, creatures which definitely seem interesting, but it's not necessarily specific to the module alone. I think it's sort of just a bestiary, more or less. It doesn't provide us anything, that changes much. It's just cool monsters, which is good. Basically, what I'm saying is it's good that this is here, but I don't really need to look over all of it. I will look at the shoal sucker, because that's kind of a pun. Unlike the worms, the worm can unfold its face on fleshy hinges to reveal ripping teeth. Okay, so these would probably be, hidden at first. And it's got moves, and I don't know if the moves are listed anywhere. So, and then moving on, you've got items, you've got dreadful finds, which these things are cool, but it's hard to say in a sort of set campaign how a lot of them would ever really come up. Like, where is it? Yeah, this book plots hurricanes that haven't happened yet. Very cool, also not really going to matter in most circumstances, I would think. Yeah, again, Shawden's ship's log, every page reads the same. The deep things see without eyes. Doesn't really have, like, doesn't really add anything mechanically or in a sense narratively, because it adds to the setting, but it's not relevant to the particular adventure that players are likely to be on. And this sort of phrase is repeated so often that it's kind of lost its impact by this point. It does, like, having stuff like this in here, I will say, is definitely good. Other than just being cool, is definitely good for the horror element. The fact that one of the options for the thing that happens every hour is one of these dreadful finds, I think is one of the few mechanical things that really adds to horror in other ways than just presenting danger. An increased chance of failure. Like, these are actually potentially creepy, so it's good that they are explicitly something that occurs every hour, because that, is a horror mechanic, or has the potential to occur every hour. Okay. And, like, I also, like, again, the deep things see without eyes, This is practically the same as the last thing. I like these. They sort of remind me of Gossip Stones in Ocarina of Time. I really had a lot of fun looking at those and seeing things about the world, but ultimately they're not really something that appears like it's going to impact a narrative. Like, it just builds out the setting, which again is nice, but is not necessarily helpful for running something. Like, this, like, I think is something that's a little easier to work in a campaign, because it's a thing that happened apparently locally, but that same ship also apparently disappeared, and while her cadaverous crew were watching silently, okay, from the deck. I didn't see that part. Yeah, so this might be a little more helpful, or a thing you could work in, not in this particular campaign, but something. Like, again, this is sort of just setting information, which is nice, but it's not really actionable to players. It's not something that would really be part of the narrative immediately. It's sort of background stuff, and this is just a method of revealing it to player characters, even, because players might already know that. It's sort of, basic information, I think. These things come up enough that what they are, I think, is sort of just baked into the setting. It's not really new, per se, to a particular campaign. And that is it. Now I'm going to go back to see some of the stuff I skipped over. I don't really like the bribe ability here. It kind of feels so mundane compared to some of the other stuff. Like, it's something that, in theory, could just be a normal move. Yeah. It's still, I think, unfortunate that it is not clear whether these abilities are supposed to be dreadful abilities, and whether they're supposed to be some aspect of progression like those are, or you just have them immediately. Okay. Simple actions. Okay, if you get double eights, that's a crit. But that's maybe only for hits, or was a success always a hit? I can't remember. And the gains and banes are described here, just basically plus or minus a d4, or rather plus a d4 to either your chances of success or the dread die, which is effectively the failure die. that means, because you only get success added to one die, but you get, failure added to the dread die, which covers both of them. That probably makes Banes slightly worse than gains are good, but in this system that makes sense. Okay, harm ranges its severity to 1 to 4. Inflict 1 harm, 2 harm if using a weapon by making moves. Some moves increase harm even more. Horror describes how much harm inflicted. Must inflict kill, armor, and shields. Shields, can reduce. Dread die. Okay, injured heroes. After suffering 4 or more harm, heroes are injured. Hero is injured 1 dread. Makes sense. And that's another way the dread mechanic is more directly tied to character fear, which is nice. It rolls the dread die, comparing the result to the injury table. Okay. I don't know why there are 2 names there for the same effect. Like, I guess for these it makes sense because a gaping wound is different than a broken bone, but brutal blow and bloody mess don't seem that different. Plus from dread, suffer a bane until you're no longer injured. So it looks like these are sort of cumulative. Moves you make besides treat wounds add 1 dread. Alright. Okay, another way Fathom Sickness is incorporated. That's probably good. But again, getting Fathom Sickness in this case is purely a benefit because the coma isn't necessarily part of Fathom Sickness, which leads to it in one scenario, and the other aspect of Fathom Sickness is just you get an ability. Now that, I don't know that makes sense. Dreadnaught as in a pun for you're already dead and you get +2 dread. Yeah, okay. Unimaginable pain. Okay, heroes with 10 harm suffer a mortal wound instantly. So is there no way to die in this game? I'm not really clear on that. Or is the way to die just by your dread going all the way up, and then possibly landing on whatever one might lead to death? But then it's not clear, like, once your dread is full, does getting more dread have an effect? Is there a way to get an effect from having max dread after you've already got an effect from max dread without decreasing it? Okay, continue as normal. Okay, yeah, how does a character actually die in this? Oh, no, that's not gonna work. Okay. Okay, death and glory when you are dead already. And this is a move. Strong hit, death. Add your harm to the dread die. Inflict that much. Yeah, I don't really know what that means. Like, I mean, I know, you get additional damage to your move. Okay, make a final move. That implies you are dying, I think. Okay, is this Death and Glory or Last Stand? Okay, when you suffer a mortal wound, make a Last Stand. then you've got the options of, like, the formatting is really killing me here. You got the option of potentially doing a big hit. You make a final move with 2 gains. Companions gain for most moves. So I think it's, fair to say this means you are dying. And that happens when you suffer for a mortal wound. But it's really not explicitly stated. Oh, well, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna go back to mortal wound. So, based on, that move I saw earlier, I would guess that a mortal wound means your character dies, and that is, what a mortal wound generally means. However, the fact that you got 2 dread from it made me pretty sure you were still alive, because I don't know why you would be getting dread if you were dead. And that's, this line keeps coming up of you're dead already, but that makes it even less clear whether anyone is dying or not. Like, maybe they mean you have just recently died already, but dead already makes it sound like you were dead before this even happened. I think so. Maybe anytime this comes up, it's supposed to be saying that you're dying. Okay, yeah, because, like, the line comes up here and it just says continue as normal, which definitely makes sense. You're not, like, makes it sound like you're not dead. So I really don't know what the conditions for death are for this game. Which is, funny because it's supposed to be something that happens a lot. So I'd like to know what actually triggers it. Okay. Inflicting suffering harm, injured heroes, basic moves. Okay. Okay, so it does look like also of relevance to the module is that when you get moved to a random location, you also add a doom dice. And like most of these moves really don't give me a clue of how a character sort of normally interacts through the game. Like, here we've got pretty much all combat. And then you can search, you can move around a bit, you can gather information, which doesn't seem that different from searching. You can try to convince people, and you can lower dread. So there doesn't appear to be like a lot of problem solving methods in this, which really narrows the field of problems you could encounter. Which again sort of makes it hard to see what makes up the game narratively other than just encountering monsters and or hazards. Okay, I'm trying to find the basic move thing. Okay. Basic move. Huh. Okay, an archetype move or a basic move, as in a class sort of move or other kind of move. And simple actions. are just everything else and don't even have a chance of failure. Like, I've seen sort of generic moves in PBTA where it's like, use this when you want to do something that has a chance of failure, but, isn't covered by the list of options we've selected. But there doesn't appear to be something like this here, so if you're not doing one of these things, you can't really fail. It looks like. Right, my thoughts overall. The rulebook is really stylish, without a doubt. I don't love the formatting of it entirely, but it definitely grabs the attention. The art is great. It looks relatively cool. The setting information, I haven't really been able to glean a ton from this. Like, the most detail I got was these, and they all seem decent, but there was enough terms in them I didn't understand that, I feel like I don't really have that much of a grasp on them, and overall, I wasn't provided with a lot of information. I know there's a lot of stuff around water and dead things and deep things, but not in a way that really does much for me tonally or grabs my interest. Like, none of it's bad, per se, but my imagination is not at this point captured by the setting. The classes seemed fairly solid, so that was good. But, I think if I were to play this, I'd have a decent time. It would function well enough, but I would have a hard time without really changing the way the game worked or changing the story of this sample campaign completely. I would have a hard time really generating any horror. And, or much of an interest in the plot for just running around through cool sounding locations and encountering fun monsters and fighting them. This seems like it functions. And if you want to do that specifically with a fairly light game mechanically, this works for that. But in terms of being an actually narrative game like it wants to, I'm not sure it actually has that covered. And also, the death rules really need to be cleared up. Like, if a mainly monster encounter based game where the mechanics are both rules light and sort of unspecific is what they wanted to go for, they've definitely achieved that. I just don't know that that appeals to me more than a more mechanically complex or clear monster fighting game. And also, it doesn't really seem like that's what they were going for based on how they described the game. And some of the mechanics, the Dread mechanics and the Fathoms mechanics could maybe use a bit more polish. So, it works. It's just definitely not what I would call fully realized.